My name is Corinne Hale. I am 52 years old, and until this winter, I worked as a community kitchen volunteer in a small town outside Denver. I never imagined my life would unravel on Christmas Eve, a night when families gather, lights shimmer across frozen windows, and the world feels gentle for a moment. Yet that was the night my husband replaced me with a younger woman. The sentence still echoes inside me like a cracked bell. I walked out of our home without a coat thick enough for the cold, without a plan, without even the strength to argue. I simply stepped into the snow and let the door close behind me. The air outside cut through my sweater like broken glass. I made my way to a small public park at the end of our street, a place where parents usually brought their children to play. Tonight, it was deserted. The bench I chose was covered in a thin sheet of frost that soaked straight through the fabric of my pants. I sat anyway. My breath formed pale clouds in front of me, each one dissolving before I could catch it. My hands trembled from both the cold and the quiet shock of what had happened inside my own kitchen. I looked down at my winter boots, scuffed leather, worn at the toes, lined on the inside with the faint scent of cedar from the closet where they lived each year. These boots had carried me through every winter since my daughter was in middle school. They felt sturdy and familiar, the one thing about me that had not been replaced. I curled my toes deeper inside them for warmth. That was when I noticed him. A man at the far end of the path, tall, thin, hunched forward as though the cold were carving its way into his spine. He moved slowly, almost drifting. When he stepped under the street lamp, I saw his bare feet pressed directly into the snow. His skin was turning a frightening shade of blue. He stood there shivering so hard I could hear his teeth clicking against each other. For a moment, I hesitated. My life had just fallen apart. My chest felt cracked open. I told myself I was too broken to help anyone. But then something inside me shifted, a quiet instinct I had spent years ignoring. I pushed myself up from the bench and walked toward him, each step crunching through the ice. He lifted his head when I approached. His eyes were alert, sharp, far too intelligent to belong to someone who had lost everything. Still, he whispered with a raw voice that scraped through the wind. He said I should stay warm, that the temperature was dropping quickly, that it was dangerous for anyone to be out here. The concern in his voice startled me. It should have been me offering those words, not him. I knelt on the snow in front of him and loosened the laces of my boots. My fingers burned from the cold. He tried to step back, insisting he did not want to take anything from me, but I had already made my decision. I pulled the boots from my feet. The shock of the frozen ground jolted up my legs like a violent current. I slid the boots gently onto his feet, tightening the laces with hands that would not stop shaking. His breath caught as the warmth spread slowly around his toes. "There," I said, my voice thin but steady. "You need them more than I do." The man stared at me with an expression I could not read, something between disbelief and a kind of sorrowful gratitude. He bowed his head slightly, not in a dramatic way, but as though he had not been seen by another human being in a very long time. 2 hours later, as I limped back toward home with numb feet and the faint hope that I might find shelter for the night, the world changed. 7 black SUVs rolled to a stop around me. Their headlights cut through the swirling snow like blades. Doors opened in perfect unison. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. From the center vehicle, the barefoot man stepped out, now wearing my boots and standing with a confidence that seemed to reshape the night itself. He looked directly into my eyes, his voice calm and clear, and he said a single sentence that changed the rest of my life. Before we go further, I hope you can take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps stories like mine reach more people and keeps this space alive for everyone who needs it. The words that man spoke to me in the snow kept echoing in my mind as I walked, but the cold pulled me backward into the memory that had pushed me out of my own home only hours earlier. Before the park, before the boots, before the SUVs, there was my kitchen. It had always been the warmest room in the house, a sanctuary lined with holiday spices and old recipes. But that evening, the warmth turned brittle. The yellow light above the stove cast long shadows over the counter, and the smell of cinnamon rolls cooling on a wire rack felt strangely out of place. I stood near the sink, wiping my hands on a towel, when Graham stepped in. His posture was stiff, as if he had rehearsed something difficult. The wall clock ticked above us, each second stretching like a strained thread. He did not sit. He did not touch the counter. He simply stood in the center of the room with his shoulders pulled back in a way that made me uneasy. When he spoke, his voice lacked any of the gentleness that had once been familiar. He said my name first, and then he said our marriage was over, not with anger, but with a finality that sliced through the air. He said he needed someone who made him feel young again, someone who reflected the version of himself he wished to see. The kitchen felt colder with every word, as though the winter outside had seeped into the walls. I remember gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. My palms felt rough against the wood. Years of washing dishes, kneading dough, and carrying groceries had left small calluses on my hands. I looked down at them for a moment, at the lines around my wrists, at the faint burn mark. From a pot I had lifted too quickly last winter. These hands had built a home. These hands had raised a daughter. These hands had weathered every storm he had claimed we would face together. Yet now he stood across from me, untouched by hesitation, telling me he wanted someone who made him feel alive in ways I apparently no longer could. Emily entered the doorway then. She was 25, old enough to understand and young enough to feel torn. Her eyes darted between us. She asked what was happening, but her voice trembled like a candle fighting wind. Graham answered before I could draw a breath. He told her we had grown apart, that he needed a different kind of joy, that this was something adults sometimes had to face. She looked at me, waiting for my reaction, perhaps hoping I would argue or fight back. But I felt a strange calm settle inside me. Not numbness, but clarity. I simply said that her father had made his choice. Emily stepped back slightly, not in rejection, but in confusion. She told us she needed time to think, and then she left the room, her footsteps fading down the hallway, caught between loyalty and discomfort. When the door closed behind her, the silence pressed against my ears. Graham took a breath, maybe expecting tears or questions. But I did none of that. I reached for the back of a chair to steady myself once more. I told him I understood. I told him he was free to chase whatever version of youth he believed he had lost. I did not beg him to stay. I did not ask him why. There was nothing left in the room that required explanation. I walked upstairs to our bedroom. My legs felt heavy, as though I were wading through water. I opened my closet and reached for the scarf my mother had knitted for me when I was 20. It was soft, faded at the edges, and carried the faint scent of her lavender soap. It had become my second skin in the winters after she passed. I draped it around my neck and felt a small strength rise inside my chest, a reminder that I came from women who had survived harder winters than this one. When I stepped back into the hallway, I did not look into the living room where Graham waited. I walked straight to the front door. The wooden floor creaked under my feet in familiar rhythms, like a soft farewell. I opened the door and felt the first blast of cold against my face. The wind clawed at my hair. The sky was a soft gray, the kind that comes before a heavy snowfall. I stepped outside without speaking. Behind me, I heard Graham say my name, but I did not turn around. I closed the door with a quiet click, a sound gentler and more decisive than any argument could have been. The snow swallowed my footsteps as I moved away from the house. The scarf warmed my neck, but my hands were bare. I tucked them into my sleeves and kept walking toward the park, unaware that the night ahead would turn my life upside down in ways I could not imagine. I thought I had reached the end of something. I did not know yet that I was walking toward the beginning. I walked through the quiet streets after leaving my house, and the snow thickened around me in soft sheets. Light from the street lamps reflected off the icy pavement, casting long, pale streaks that looked almost like frozen rivers. My fingers curled inside my sleeves for warmth, and the scarf my mother had made pressed gently against my neck. The neighborhood felt familiar and foreign at the same time. Every porch light seemed to belong to a life I no longer had access to. When I reached the small park at the end of the block, the cold intensified. The wind pushed against my legs as if urging me to go back, but I kept moving until I saw the bench. It was covered with a thin layer of frost shining under the dim lamp above it. I sat down slowly. The chill of the metal shot straight through my body. My breath turned into white clouds in front of me, rising and fading in the air. My legs grew numb as the cold seeped up from the ground. I rubbed my hands together, but the warmth never came. My teeth clenched against the sharp sting of winter. I stared at my boots, tracing the worn edges with my eyes. They looked sturdy and reliable, a small reminder of the many years I had worked through every challenge without asking for help. A question rose inside me, quiet but relentless. I wondered how long I had been living this way, always absorbing, always giving, always stitching broken pieces together while ignoring the cracks in myself. My voice stayed low, nearly swallowed by the wind, as I asked myself who I had been living for and what I had left now that the foundation of my life had collapsed. The bench felt harder with every passing minute. Snowflakes landed on my hair and shoulders. Their cold weight grew heavier the longer I sat. I tucked my knees closer to my chest and let the night settle around me. For a moment, I considered staying there until dawn, simply letting the numbness swallow the ache inside my chest. Then I noticed movement near the edge of the path. A figure was approaching. Tall, thin, wrapped in layers that were far too light for the temperature. As he stepped closer, the street lamp revealed his bare feet pressing directly into the snow. His skin was bluish near the toes and his steps were unsteady. I straightened instinctively. He walked toward the bench, shivering so violently that I could hear the faint clatter of his teeth. His eyes flicked up, alert despite the cold. Something in his posture told me he was used to observing people, not being noticed by them. He stopped a few feet away and spoke with a cracked whisper. He told me to stay warm, that the weather was harsher than it looked, that this was not a night to be outside longer than necessary. His concern surprised me. I had come undone in my own kitchen only hours earlier, and yet here he was, freezing, urging me to take care of myself. I felt the sting of irony, sharp and almost cruel. I responded softly. I told him I had socks, and he did not. The moment the words left my mouth, I knew what I would do next. I leaned forward and started unlacing my boots. My fingers trembled as I worked through the knots, both from the cold and from the weight of everything that had happened that night. The man shook his head slightly, insisting that he could not take them. But my mind was already made up. My body moved faster than my thoughts, as if an old instinct had taken control. I pulled the boots off my feet and felt the sudden shock of the frozen ground beneath my thin socks. The cold rushed in like a sharp breath, stealing the warmth from my skin. I tightened my jaw and steadied myself. I held out the boots to him. He hesitated again, staring at me with eyes that looked far too clear to belong to someone beaten down by the world. He accepted them only when he realized I would not put them back on. I watched him slide his feet inside, watched the leather mold around him, watched the relief wash over his face as the warmth spread upward. His shoulders softened. His eyes flickered with a sincerity that made me pause. He thanked me with a slight bow of his head, quiet and deliberate. Without my boots, the cold gnawed at my feet in quick, relentless pulses, but I forced myself to stand. Something about giving them away felt necessary, almost cleansing. The boots had been with me through so many winters, but tonight they needed to be with someone else. I stepped away from the bench with slow, careful movements, unaware that the man whose feet I had just covered would soon reappear in a way that would alter the course of my life. I walked away from the park with slow, unsteady steps, each one driven by a mixture of numbness and instinct. The snow had grown thicker, settling over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket. My socks were soaked completely, and every few feet a sharp jolt of pain traveled from my ankles up through my legs. My toes burned first, then faded into a frightening dullness. I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck, trying to keep the warmth from escaping. The icy pavement beneath my feet felt unforgiving, but I kept moving. Home was only a few blocks away, yet it felt like a distant shore. Street after street slipped behind me in silence. Christmas lights twinkled in windows, casting warm colors across the snow, but none of that warmth reached me. Every breath I drew sent a thin streak of white into the night air. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, forcing myself to ignore the growing stiffness in my legs. The world around me was still, as though the entire town had turned inward for the holiday while I wandered through the cold edges of it. Nearly 2 hours passed before I reached the long curve leading toward my street. The familiar houses came into view, but the sense of belonging I once felt here had vanished. I stepped carefully, stopping once to bend forward and rub my aching feet through the thin fabric of my socks. My fingers brushed against the icy cotton, and a wave of panic rose in my chest at how little sensation remained in my toes. I straightened myself and continued. The snow was falling harder now. I turned the corner, expecting nothing more than the quiet hum of a sleeping neighborhood. Instead, the air shifted. A low engine sound rolled toward me. Then another, and another. The vibrations pulsed beneath the snow. My breath hitched as 7 black SUVs turned onto the street in a synchronized arc, their headlights slicing through the falling flakes. The beams illuminated the ground around me, making my damp socks glow faintly against the white pavement. I froze, gripping the edge of my scarf. The vehicles slowed, surrounding me in a loose circle without touching the curb. The engines idled in unison, giving the impression of something carefully coordinated. My heart thudded in my chest with sharp, uneven beats. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining it, if the cold had finally muddled my mind. But the warm air from the grills brushed against my legs, proving this was real. My body tensed, though my feet could barely feel the ground beneath them. The doors opened at the same time. Men dressed in dark winter coats stepped out, their movements precise. They were not threatening, but they were not casual either. Their eyes scanned the surroundings before turning toward me. I swallowed hard, unable to take a full breath. Then the center SUV opened. The tall man from the park stepped down. Only now, he looked entirely different. His hair was neatly combed. His face was clean, free of the frost and exhaustion I had seen earlier. He wore a tailored coat, and my boots were laced tightly on his feet, as though they had always belonged there. The transformation was so complete that I blinked twice, trying to make my vision adjust. He walked toward me with steady steps, no longer shivering, no longer fragile. Something about the way he carried himself forced me to straighten my spine. I squinted slightly, trying to see him clearly through the swirling flakes. The contrast between the man I had helped and the man approaching me now was almost impossible to comprehend. He stopped a few feet away, giving me space, as though he understood the shock settling over me. The others remained by the vehicles, waiting silently. He looked at me with eyes that seemed far too perceptive, far too measured. He addressed me with a quiet steadiness that made the moment feel even stranger. He called me Mrs. Hale, speaking my name with deliberate clarity. He said that I had seen him when no one else bothered to look. The words sank into the air between us, heavy with meaning I could not decode. A rush of confusion washed through me. My numb feet throbbed against the frozen ground as I searched his face for answers. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His expression softened slightly, as if he understood more about my life than I had ever spoken aloud. Yet he offered no explanation, no reason for the SUVs, no story behind the transformation. He simply held my gaze for a calm moment that stretched into something fragile and powerful at the same time. Then he stepped back and nodded to one of the men near the SUVs. Before I could gather my thoughts, he turned toward the vehicles. The doors opened again, ready to take him away. My questions hung in the cold air, unanswered. The engines began to hum more deeply. The man who had worn frost on his skin only hours earlier climbed into the back seat with the poise of someone used to commanding entire rooms. I stood there in my damp socks, unable to move, unable to understand, knowing only that my life had shifted again in a direction I could not yet name. I could not sleep the night after the SUVs disappeared down my street. My feet throbbed beneath 2 layers of blankets, and I kept replaying the image of the man stepping out of the center vehicle wearing my boots with such quiet certainty. The house was painfully silent. Even the refrigerator hummed more softly than usual, as though it, too, sensed that something in my life had shifted. By morning, I still had no explanation for what had happened. I wrapped my mother's scarf around my shoulders and moved slowly into the kitchen, preparing a cup of tea to warm my shaking hands. When the doorbell rang, the sound cut through the stillness like a sharp line of light. I hesitated before opening the door, unsure of what or who to expect. There, standing on my snowy porch, was the man from the park. Only now he was dressed in a dark wool coat, polished shoes, and a pair of gloves that looked expensive enough to belong in a catalog. My boots were gone. He held himself with a calm composure, and for a moment we simply looked at each other as the cold air drifted between us. He introduced himself politely, his voice steady and warm. He asked if he could come inside for a few minutes. Something about the sincerity in his tone disarmed me. I stepped aside. He entered my kitchen carefully, as if he did not want to disturb the fragile order of my morning. Another man followed him in, younger, with sharp eyes and a posture that suggested discipline. He introduced himself as Nathan Ward, assistant and operations advisor. He gave me a small nod of respect, then stood near the doorway, hands folded behind his back. I offered them both tea, mostly out of habit. They declined with polite gestures. The taller man took off his gloves and folded them neatly on the table. Then he introduced himself with a quiet clarity that settled the room. His name was Elias Ward, co-founder of Wardstone Development. I felt the air shift as soon as the words landed. I knew the name. Everyone in Colorado knew the name. Wardstone was behind major housing projects, community centers, and urban renewal designs. They were powerful, wealthy, influential. My pulse quickened. Elias noticed my reaction but continued speaking without the slightest tone of superiority. His manner was calm, almost humble. He thanked me for what I had done the night before, and I felt a warmth rush to my face that had nothing to do with the tea cooling on the table. I told him it had simply been cold, and he had been barefoot. He gave a slight smile and said kindness was rarely that simple. Nathan shifted his weight subtly behind him, as though accustomed to watching Elias navigate delicate moments. His presence was firm but respectful. He observed everything without judgment. Elias continued. He told me he had been conducting what he called a field study, a personal experiment in understanding how people respond when faced with someone who appears to have nothing. He said he had been doing this quietly for several months, slipping into different neighborhoods with minimal protections, observing how strangers reacted to discomfort, vulnerability, or need. His words made me tense. I felt a tightening in my chest as I considered the implications. A wealthy man pretending to be homeless, observing people like specimens, testing their compassion. My hands curled slightly at my sides. Elias noticed. He acknowledged the unease without trying to soften it. He said he understood how it might appear and admitted he had grown disillusioned over the years, that after losing his wife to an unexpected illness, he no longer trusted the sincerity of human motives. He wanted to know if kindness still existed in the world without being purchased, expected, or demanded. The honesty in his admission softened something inside me. The grief behind his voice did not feel performed. It felt lived in, raw, real. I asked him if he found what he had been looking for. He looked at me with an expression that held both gratitude and sadness. He said yes. He had found proof of kindness the night I handed him my boots with shaking hands. Silence settled over the kitchen, not heavy but thoughtful. Nathan finally stepped forward slightly, speaking for the first time. He said Elias rarely let anyone see the full picture of this experiment. He told me I had shown something important, something that could have been overlooked in a world moving too quickly. I looked between them, still unsure how I fit into this unfolding truth. Elias then asked if I would sit with him for a moment. His tone remained gentle. We talked for a short while at the kitchen table, the cold wooden surface grounding me as he explained how the experiment had shaped his work and his fears. The conversation did not drag on. It simply existed, warm and fragile in the middle of my broken Christmas morning. When they stood to leave, he told me he did not expect anything from me. He simply wanted me to understand why last night had unfolded the way it did. He thanked me again and stepped onto the snowy porch with Nathan at his side. I watched them walk away, unaware that this was only the beginning of our story. After Elias and Nathan left my porch, the silence inside my house felt heavier than before. Every corner echoed with memories I did not want to relive. I walked from room to room without purpose, touching the back of a chair, adjusting the curtain, running my fingertips along the counter. Nothing grounded me. My mother's scarf rested around my shoulders, but even it could not warm the hollow space inside my chest. I knew I could not stay there. The walls felt too tight, as if they were closing in on the truth I had been trying to hide from myself. So I grabbed my keys and stepped back out into the cold. My feet were still tender from the night before, but I kept walking until the old brick church came into view. Its windows glowed softly, and the faint smell of warm bread drifted from the side entrance. The community kitchen inside had always been a place of quiet refuge. Tonight it felt like the only place I could breathe. When I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the warmth hit me like a gentle embrace. A few volunteers were finishing their evening cleanup. Metal trays clattered softly as they stacked them, and the hum of the dishwasher filled the room like a comforting heartbeat. Standing near the large steel sink was a woman I had seen many times but never spoken to deeply. June Morless. I am 58 years old. She had the kind of presence that made people feel seen, the kind of face etched with stories. She turned the moment she sensed me enter, and her eyes softened instantly. She dried her hands on a towel and approached without hesitation. She asked me if I was cold, but her voice carried more understanding than curiosity. When I nodded, she studied my face with a quiet intensity, as if reading something written there. She told the other volunteers she would finish up and guided me toward a small table near the back door. The kitchen lights reflected off the tiled floor, creating a soft glow around us. I sat down slowly, gripping the edge of my scarf. June took the seat across from me, folding her hands in her lap. She did not ask what had happened. She did not need to. She told me she had seen enough women walk into this kitchen wearing that same expression. The look of someone who had just reached the edge of something long endured. Her honesty loosened something inside me. I told her about Graham's words, the end of our marriage, the cold bench, the man in the snow, the confusing encounter with Elias. I spoke quietly, afraid the words might crumble if I gave them too much force. June listened with an unwavering calm. When I finished, she reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over mine. She said heartbreak had a way of stripping people down to their most honest selves. She then shared a piece of her own story, not dramatically, but like a small offering between two women who understood loss. She told me her husband had left her 12 years earlier for a woman half her age. She described the moment she realized she had built her entire life around someone who saw her only as a shadow. She said she had stood in her kitchen holding a pan of burnt rice, wondering how a lifetime could dissolve in a single sentence. She confessed she had felt broken for months. But one day, while washing dishes in this very kitchen, she realized that leaving her home did not mean she had lost her identity. She rebuilt herself piece by piece, learning to live quietly without apology. Her story was simple, but it landed inside me with the weight of truth. She was the reflection I did not know I needed, a woman who had walked through fire and kept her dignity intact. June looked at me with a determination that felt strangely protective. She reached into the front pocket of her apron and pulled out a small folded letter. The paper was slightly creased, as if she had held it many times. She placed it gently in my hand. She told me to read it when my hand stopped shaking. Her voice carried a firmness that told me this letter mattered, though she did not explain why. I stared at the paper, feeling its texture warm against my palm. She squeezed my fingers once before standing. She said healing does not arrive with noise. It arrives in small decisions that guide us away from the ruins we thought we had to live in. She reminded me that I was not alone. Women before me had carried similar weights and learned to set them down. She had, and she believed I could too. When I stepped back outside the church, the air smelled of wood smoke and distant pine. I held the letter tightly in my hand. The snow crunched under my feet as I walked into the night, unaware that the words inside that folded page would change the direction of my next steps and draw me closer to a path I never expected to follow. I barely slept the night after leaving the church. June's letter sat on my nightstand, its presence both comforting and heavy. I had not opened it yet. My hand still trembled whenever I thought about everything that had happened. Morning came quietly. Light filtered through the curtains in faint streaks, and the air smelled of cold fabric and the faint lavender from my mother's scarf, still draped over the back of a chair. I brewed tea again, hoping its warmth would anchor me. As I held the cup between my palms, my phone buzzed on the counter. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a holiday greeting from someone unaware of my unraveling life. But the name on the screen made my breath catch. Nathan Ward. His message was simple and formal. Elias wanted to speak with me. Could he pick me up in 30 minutes? My first instinct was to refuse. My life felt too fragile, too exposed, and I was not ready for another unexpected revelation. But something inside me stirred. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the faint echo of the courage June believed I could rediscover. I typed a short yes and set my tea aside. 30 minutes later, a dark sedan pulled up in front of my house. Nathan stepped out, impeccably dressed, his posture as straight as the line of the car's roof. He opened the door for me with a polite nod. His calm presence eased some of the tension in my chest. We drove toward the city, the snow around us turning into plowed streets and tall buildings. Nathan remained mostly silent, speaking only to confirm a few directions. His manner was not cold, just deliberate. When we arrived, the car stopped in front of an enormous community hall that looked abandoned. The windows were dusty, and the paint along the front pillars peeled like old bark. Yet beneath its wear, I sensed potential, like a forgotten story waiting to be told again. Elias stood near the entrance, speaking with two architects who held large blueprints under their arms. When he turned and saw me, his expression softened. He walked toward me with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the frigid air. He thanked me for coming, then gestured toward the building. He said he had been planning to restore this old center into a place for families, seniors, and young people who needed a safe space. He explained that the pandemic had shut it down, funding had dried up, and the city lost interest. He wanted to bring it back to life, but he needed people who understood the community, not just the numbers. He looked at me as if the meaning behind his words rested solely in my reaction. Inside, the hall was dim but filled with echoes of the past. Rows of chairs stood haphazardly. Faded murals lined the walls. A scent of old wood and dust drifted through the air. Nathan led me to a small office at the back of the hall. He paused at the doorway and explained that they wanted my help with a real situation, something happening at that very moment in the adjacent room. A small group of volunteers was arguing about the new distribution schedule for winter supplies. Voices carried through the thin wall, sharp, frustrated, overlapping. I told Nathan I was not trained for conflict resolution. He responded with a steady tone, saying that Elias believed I understood people in a way that could not be taught. His confidence unsettled me. Still, I stepped inside the room. 4 volunteers stood in a tense semicircle, their voices raised. One insisted the schedule was unfair. Another complained that families were being overlooked. A third said the new plan was impossible with limited resources. Their frustration filled the room like static. I hesitated, then walked closer, asking gently if everyone could pause for a moment. Something in my voice must have cut through the noise. They turned toward me, surprised. I listened to each of them. Truly listened. Not to choose sides, but to understand what lay beneath the anger. Fear, exhaustion, worry about not having enough to give. When they finished, I acknowledged their concerns, then suggested a simpler system that balanced their workload while still prioritizing the families who needed help most. I offered to stay and sort supplies myself if that would ease the burden. The room shifted. There, shoulders lowered. The tension softened. One of the volunteers even let out a relieved breath. It was not dramatic, it was human. When I stepped back into the large hall, Elias stood, waiting near a window streaked with dust. He watched me with an expression that made my stomach twist, not with fear, but with a quiet recognition. He approached slowly, his hands tucked in his coat pockets. He told me compassion was a form of strength, something I had carried for years without realizing it. He said I had simply forgotten to value it. His words sank into me like warm light breaking through clouds. I lowered my gaze, unsure how to accept such affirmation. When I looked back up, Elias was still watching me with a steady calm. I felt, for the first time in a long while, the faint outline of possibility. The days after my visit to the community hall felt strangely full. I still woke with heaviness in my chest, but the hours no longer swallowed me whole. I helped Nathan organize supply lists, met with 2 local volunteers, and walked through the dusty hall with Elias as he described the renovations he hoped to begin in the spring. Even the cold seemed less punishing when I had somewhere to be, something to offer. June's letter remained unopened on my nightstand, waiting with quiet patience. I told myself I would read it soon. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than expected. Snow clung to the roofline and the porch creaked beneath my boots. When I stepped inside, the air felt still, as though the house was holding its breath. I set my scarf on the hook by the door and walked toward the kitchen, already thinking about making tea. I had not taken 2 steps before someone knocked. The sound was hesitant but persistent, a rhythm I recognized immediately. When I opened the door, Graham stood on my porch. His shoulders were hunched against the cold, and his hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets. His hair was uncombed, and the lines around his eyes looked deeper than I remembered. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking, as if searching for the right version of himself to present. He said he wanted to talk. He said he had been thinking. He said he realized he had made a mistake on Christmas Eve. His voice wavered at the edges, the way it used to when he practiced sincerity rather than felt it. I stepped aside out of courtesy. He walked in slowly, looking around the house as though expecting it to greet him. We stood in the living room, 2 people who had shared decades but now felt separated by a quiet canyon. Graham cleared his throat and said he had been confused, that the holiday pressure had gotten to him, that maybe he had acted too quickly. Then he paused, his gaze drifting to the floor. His next words emerged with the soft weight of someone trying to guide the conversation rather than truly reflect on it. He said we were too old to start over, that rebuilding our marriage would be easier than going separate ways. He said, stability mattered at our age. His words hit me, but not in the way he expected. For years, I had carried the fear of being left behind, the fear that age made me invisible. But after everything that had happened, after the bench in the snow, after June's steady wisdom, after the way Elias believed in a part of me I had forgotten, something inside me aligned. Graham's statement was not comforting. It was revealing. I looked at him carefully, studying the familiar features I had once memorized without trying. His expression was a combination of guilt, hope, and something else I recognized too well: convenience. He wanted the stability I had built, not the woman I was becoming. I stepped closer, enough that he could not ignore the clarity in my eyes. I told him 3 simple sentences, each one shaped by a truth I had carried silently for years. I told him I was only 52. I told him I was not dead. I told him I was not afraid to start over. The words left my mouth calmly, without anger or theatrical force. Yet the power in them filled the room. Graham blinked, startled, as though he had expected tears or pleas or negotiation. But I felt none of those things. I felt a steady warmth rise through my chest, the kind that comes from finally hearing one's own voice after a long silence. He tried to respond, but his sentence faltered. He looked around again, as if searching for the version of me he had known, the version who might soften the truth for him. But she was gone. Or maybe she had grown into someone he could no longer predict. I walked toward the front door. The floorboards beneath me creaked with the familiar rhythm of a decision. My hand reached for the doorknob. For a moment, my fingers trembled. not from fear, but from the weight of what this gesture meant. It was the slow pivot, the quiet step that reshaped everything. I felt the cold of the metal under my palm, steady and real. I opened the door gently. No raised voice, no slamming, no dramatic ending, just a quiet release. I told him it was time for both of us to face the truth of who we were now. He stood frozen, unsure whether to argue or accept what hung between us. The wind brushed past us, carrying the scent of pine. I stepped aside, inviting the moment to settle. Graham finally nodded, though his eyes held a confusion he could not mask. He walked onto the porch with slow steps. I watched him for a moment, not with bitterness, but with a calm understanding that our chapter had ended long before this conversation. Then I closed the door softly. The click echoed through the house like a heartbeat, finding its rhythm again. After Graham left, the house fell into a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. I stood by the door for a long moment, letting the quiet settle inside my bones. My hand still tingled from the cold doorknob, and my breath came out in slow waves. For the first time in years, I sensed something steady growing inside me. Not joy, not relief, something quieter. The beginning of reclaiming my own life. When I walked into my bedroom, my eyes drifted toward the nightstand. June's folded letter waited there, still untouched. My hands were finally steady enough to open it. I sat on the edge of the bed, smoothed the creases, and unfolded the page. Her handwriting was elegant and slightly slanted, as though shaped by years of writing grocery lists and prayers in dim kitchen light. She wrote about women like us, women who had held families together without applause, women who became the pillars no one noticed until a crack appeared. She said the world often measured women by how much they could carry, not by who they were beneath the weight. She reminded me that the foundation of a home is built from countless quiet acts, the meals prepared, the bills paid, the late-night talks, the forgiveness offered, the resilience forged in silence. She said we were not replaceable, even when someone tried to replace us. She insisted that a woman who had once been the backbone of a family could build herself again, stronger and more intentional, if she allowed herself the chance. Her final lines read with surprising firmness, "You were the foundation, Corinne. Do not forget what stands because of you." My throat tightened. I folded the letter back into its square, but this time I held it like something precious. My mother's scarf rested across my shoulders, and the two pieces of wisdom, one written, one woven, felt like threads pulling me toward the woman I had once been before life demanded so much of me. The next morning, I began cleaning, not to erase the past, but to understand what parts of it I wanted to carry forward. I opened drawers filled with old birthday cards, faded movie tickets, and stacks of receipts from years I could barely remember. I placed some items gently in a donation box, tossed others away, and kept a small pile that still held meaning. A photograph of Emily at 7, smiling with missing front teeth, a small ceramic dish my mother had bought for me at a winter market, a note Graham had written during our early years, before life hardened us. I took down several framed pictures of Graham and me, not with anger, but with a sense of acceptance. They represented a chapter, not a sentence. I wrapped the frames carefully and stored them in a box at the back of the closet. I kept one photo from our early marriage, not because of him, but because I liked the way I looked in it, confident, hopeful, unaware of how heavy life would become. By afternoon, Emily came by. She still looked torn, carrying the weight of being an adult child caught in a storm she did not create. She asked if we could talk. We sat at the kitchen table, the one place where difficult truths always seemed to surface. She told me she felt guilty, unsure whether to stay neutral or defend me. She said people did not talk enough about what divorce meant when the children were grown. Everyone assumed adults could handle it. But she felt something inside her shifting, struggling to reconcile the parents she once believed we were with the realities unfolding now. I listened to her carefully. Then I told her something I had never said out loud. I confessed that I had dropped out of college because I became pregnant with her. I said I had dreams once, quiet ones, about becoming a teacher, but I chose our family instead. Not with regret, but with conviction. I told her I loved her fiercely and would make the same choice again, but that it did come with sacrifices. Sacrifices I had never asked anyone to repay, yet ones that shaped me more deeply than I let people see. Emily stared at me with wide eyes. She reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it. She apologized for the distance she showed when Graham ended the marriage. She said she did not know how much of my life had been built around keeping us steady. Her voice cracked when she admitted she feared losing both of her parents at once, one to selfishness and one to heartbreak. I squeezed her hand back. I told her she did not have to choose sides. She only had to choose herself and the truth that felt right to her. I told her I would be fine, stronger than she realized. She nodded slowly, her shoulders lowering as though she had been carrying a weight she could finally set down. When she left, the house felt different, not empty, but spacious, as if clearing out the clutter had made room for something new. I placed June's letter in the small ceramic dish from my mother and carried it to the living room. I sat in the quiet and let the light settle across the floorboards, allowing myself to believe for the first time that a new version of my life was beginning to take shape. The morning I started the trial position as a community liaison consultant, the air outside carried the sharp scent of winter wood smoke. I wrapped my mother's scarf around my neck, slipped on my newly purchased boots, and stepped onto the porch with a mix of nerves and determination. My home felt less like a place of loss and more like a starting point. I locked the door behind me with steady hands. Nathan arrived exactly on time, as always. He stepped out of the car and gave me a short nod, formal but not distant. There was something different in his posture, a quiet acknowledgement that the last few weeks had shifted something between us. Respect, perhaps, or curiosity. Either way, I felt it. During the drive to the project site, he explained the day's tasks. I would accompany him and Elias to meet several families and small business owners affected by the redevelopment plan. My role was simple, he said. Listen, observe, understand their needs. No paperwork yet, no presentations, just human contact. The simplicity of the assignment steadied my heart. Listening was something I had spent my entire life doing. When we arrived, Elias stood near an open lot that once held an old grocery store. The steel beams, half dismantled, rose into the gray sky like ribs of a forgotten animal. He turned when he heard my footsteps and greeted me warmly, with a sincerity I still struggled to accept. He handed me a thick folder filled with maps, notes, and sketches. His eyes softened when he said he wanted me to see everything up close. We began walking through the neighborhood. Snow had been pushed to the sides of the sidewalks, forming uneven walls of gray and white. The smell of frying onions drifted from a food truck on the corner, and a young mother pushed a stroller through slush while balancing a grocery bag on her hip. It reminded me of myself years ago, when money was tight, and every step felt like a balancing act between survival and hope. Our first stop was a small apartment complex with fading paint and cracked steps. Inside, we met a widow named Eliza, who shared her concerns about rising rents. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, and she apologized repeatedly for the mess in her living room, though it was cleaner than most places I had ever lived during our lean years. I told her gently that she did not need to apologize. Her shoulders eased instantly, and she smiled at me in a way that felt like recognition. She reminded me of the woman I once was, trying to hold life together with dignity, even when it frayed at the edges. Nathan watched the interaction closely. His eyes tracked the subtle shifts in the room, the way I leaned in when Eliza spoke, the way she looked at me as if running into someone who finally understood her fears. Nathan did not interrupt. When we stepped back outside, he said nothing, but I noticed his steps fall naturally beside mine rather than ahead of me. Next, we walked to an abandoned playground behind a row of shuttered shops. The swing chains rattled in the wind. I told Elias that my daughter used to play in a park just like this one when we could not afford anything more than a day of sunshine. He listened without rushing me, his expression thoughtful. He asked what I would have wanted back then. My answer surprised even me. I told him I would have wanted someone to see the weight I was carrying, even if they could not lift it. He nodded slowly. It felt like he was storing my words away, not as data, but as pieces of something meaningful. Our final stop was a small bakery run by an older couple. The smell of warm bread seeped into our coats the moment we stepped inside. The owners were worried that construction would shut down their shop. Their fear was quiet, but present in the way the husband folded and unfolded a dish towel while speaking to us. I reassured them that the project aimed to strengthen local businesses, not erase them. Elias confirmed this with a steady tone, and the couple seemed to breathe more easily. When we stepped back outside, Nathan faced me fully for the first time that day. He said he had underestimated the value of lived experience. He said the way I spoke to people created trust faster than any strategic plan. The compliment was unexpected, and it settled inside me like a small flame. By late afternoon, the sun hung low behind the rooftops, casting a soft orange glow across the snow. As we walked back toward the car, Elias fell into step beside me. He said he had been right to bring me here. Then he added, with a quiet conviction that reached straight through my uncertainty, that compassion was a form of intelligence often overlooked in boardrooms. I let his words linger. For years, I had seen kindness as duty, not strength. But standing there, in a neighborhood that reminded me of my own past, I began to believe that what I had carried all these years might finally have a place to belong. By the time winter light stretched thin across the skyline, I had settled into the rhythm of my new work. Days at the community hall blended into meetings with local families, walks through neighborhoods being considered for redevelopment, and long conversations with Elias about what hope could look like when it was built brick by brick. Nathan grew more open as well, asking for my opinion before he finalized community reports or outreach strategies. For the first time in years, I felt the sense of purpose I had once believed was reserved only for younger women with unwrinkled hands and unbroken plans. Mine were the opposite, yet somehow more useful than ever. One late afternoon, as snow drifted lightly over the city, I arrived at the Wardstone Field office. The building was part warehouse, part planning center. Large windows let in the fading light. Architects moved around with sketches and laptops. The smell of coffee hovered near the break station. I carried a stack of notes from the bakery couple we had visited, ready to discuss possible solutions with Elias and Nathan. But as soon as I stepped inside, tension hung in the air like static. A voice rose above the hum of quiet conversations. A voice I knew, Graham. He stood near the entrance, gesturing wildly with one arm, demanding to know why the company was dragging his wife into some fantasy redevelopment scheme. Employees kept a cautious distance, unsure how to handle the intruder. My breath caught. I had wondered when he would try to push back against the reality he had created, but I had not expected him to come here. I walked forward slowly. Graham noticed me immediately. His expression shifted from outrage to forced concern. He stepped toward me, lowering his voice as if we were still a married couple discussing private matters. He said he had heard rumors that I was being taken advantage of, that a company like Wardstone did not need someone like me. He insisted I come home so we could work things out properly. His words hit me with an old heaviness, but they no longer carried the same power. I took a breath, ready to answer, when I felt a presence at my side. Elias. He stood with a calmness that seemed to settle the air around us. Nathan was a few steps behind him, posture straight, eyes sharp. Graham turned toward Elias with a challenging stare. He asked why they were involving his wife in decisions beyond her expertise. He demanded to know what they expected to gain from her. His tone grew sharper with each sentence, his frustration fueled by a fear he tried to hide beneath irritation. The employees watched from a distance, their curiosity softened by concern. I opened my mouth to intervene, but Elias lifted a hand slightly, not to silence me, but to take responsibility for the situation. He stepped forward until he stood nearly eye to eye with Graham. The contrast between them was striking. Graham carried the restless energy of a man watching his narrative crumble. Elias carried the steady confidence of someone who no longer doubted what mattered. Graham narrowed his eyes. Then he asked the question that revealed everything. He asked whether I really thought Wardstone needed me. The words were meant to diminish me, to shrink me to the size he preferred. He wanted to anchor me back into the version of Corinne that had stayed quiet in the kitchen for years. Elias did not look away. His voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath it. He said Wardstone did not need me. He said Wardstone was fortunate that I chose to work with them. He said my presence brought clarity they could not manufacture. His tone carried no exaggeration, no flattery, only the truth. The room shifted. Even the architects paused what they were doing. Graham's jaw tightened. His chest rose as though preparing for another argument, but no words followed. He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing the distance that had quietly grown between us while he was focused on himself. My heart beat steadily, not with adrenaline, but with calm. The kind of calm that comes when an invisible weight dissolves. I realized that nothing he said could tether me anymore. The version of myself he had depended on, the quiet, unquestioning one, no longer existed. I stepped closer to both men, though my eyes rested only on Elias for a moment. His quiet support anchored me. I then turned to Graham. No anger rose in me, only clarity. I told him he could leave. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain myself. Sometimes silence is the most complete truth. He stared, stunned. The room seemed to exhale as he stepped back, uncertainty shadowing his features. He muttered something under his breath, turned, and walked toward the door. His footsteps sounded misplaced in the steady rhythm of the office. When the door closed behind him, a long-held tension inside my chest released, not in a dramatic burst, but like a chain quietly unfastening. I felt light, not because someone defended me, but because I had allowed myself to accept it. Elias touched my arm gently, grounding the moment. Nathan gave a small nod of respect. I breathed in slowly, letting the air settle deep within me. I walked toward the window, feeling the cold. Light from outside brush across my face, and for the first time in years, my steps felt entirely my own. The weeks that followed felt quieter, as if life itself had begun exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Snow thawed in slow, steady lines along the sidewalks, and the city shifted from the heaviness of winter into something softer. The community center renovation moved faster than any of us expected. Every morning when I walked through the entrance, I saw new signs of progress. Fresh paint brightening the halls, repaired windows letting in warm daylight, and volunteers stacking boxes of supplies with renewed energy. It felt as though the building itself was waking up. June visited often during those final days of preparation. She had a way of filling a room with calm assurance. One morning, as I walked into the kitchen, I found her wearing a crisp new apron embroidered with the center's logo. She stood by the counter with a clipboard, discussing inventory with a manager. When she saw me, her face lit up. She held out the apron proudly and said she had been offered a permanent position running the community kitchen. Her voice trembled just slightly at the edges, as if she were still learning how to hold joy without flinching. I hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of cinnamon she always carried. She whispered that beginnings can be quiet, but they are still beginnings. Then she laughed and returned to her clipboard, already planning meals for the first week of service. Watching her filled me with a warmth I had not felt in months. It reminded me that healing does not always need a grand moment. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a steady job, a warm kitchen, or an apron bearing your name. The opening day arrived on a Saturday morning. The sky was clear, carrying hints of the coming spring. I stood near the entrance of the newly renovated hall, greeting guests and families as they walked in. The sound of children laughing bounced across the polished floors. Volunteers carried trays of warm bread. Elderly couples found seats near the front row, their hands linked in quiet expectation. I felt their hopes mixing with my own. As the speeches began, I stepped toward the center of the room. People clapped as the mayor congratulated Wardstone for investing in the community. The applause was loud, but what struck me most was the way the hall glowed with life. The murals had been restored, the floors polished, and the space filled with light that felt almost like a blessing. Elias stood a few feet away, greeting board members and city officials. His posture was relaxed, his smile genuine. When our eyes met, something inside my chest tightened and softened at the same time. Not romantic longing, not yet, but recognition, a quiet understanding built from shared moments and unspoken truths. He excused himself from his conversation and walked toward me. When he reached my side, he looked around the hall with a sort of pride that seemed to belong to both of us. He said none of this would feel the same without the people who gave it its heart. Then he glanced at me with an expression I had seen only once before, back when I handed him my boots in the freezing park. It was the look of someone who had been seen, not just observed. Nathan joined us briefly, giving me a nod that felt almost like a salute. He said the volunteers respected me. He said my perspective had shaped the center in ways he could not quantify. I thanked him, though my voice shook slightly. It is a strange feeling to be recognized after years of invisibility. As the ribbon cutting began, I stepped to the side, letting others take the front. I watched children chase each other among the chairs. I watched June laugh with the kitchen staff. I watched families sit at long tables, relieved to have a place where they were welcomed rather than judged. The hall pulsed with warmth, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing inside something that reflected my own awakening. Elias eventually found me again near the mural of a rising sun painted across the far wall. He stood next to me quietly, his hands folded behind his back. We shared a long stillness, the kind that feels safe rather than awkward. Then he spoke, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. He said I had seen him when he was disguised and forgotten. Then he added the echo of the line that had once shaken my world. He said he saw me now as well. The words rested gently in the air, settling deep inside me. Not a declaration, not a promise, a recognition, a bridge, a beginning. I did not reply right away. Instead, I let the warmth of the room wash through me. The voices, the laughter, the faint scent of bread drifting from June's kitchen. When I finally turned to him, I simply nodded, and that was enough. The center glowed behind us, alive and breathing. A gentle rebirth, not just for the building, but for me. The snow returned the following week, falling in thin, delicate strands that softened the edges of the city. It was the kind of snowfall that did not demand attention, but invited reflection. After the long months that had reshaped my life, I felt a quiet pull toward the place where everything had begun. So one morning, wrapped in my mother's scarf and a warm coat, I walked back to the small park at the end of my old street. The bench waited exactly where it had always been, though the frost along its surface glimmered like scattered salt under the pale winter sun. As I approached, the air around me felt familiar, almost sacred. This was the place where I had sat alone on Christmas Eve, where the cold had bitten into my bones and grief pressed against my ribs like a weight I could not lift. It was also the place where I had first seen Elias shivering in the snow, the beginning of everything I had not known I needed. I brushed the frost off the metal seat and sat down. The cold seeped through my coat, not painfully, but with the grounding clarity of a truth remembered rather than feared. I let my feet rest on the snowy ground and breathed in the quiet. My breath formed soft clouds that rose gently before fading into the morning air. In my hands, I held the pair of boots I had given Elias that night. He had returned them to me a few days earlier, cleaned and restored so carefully that they looked almost new. The laces were replaced, the leather reconditioned, the scuffs softened but not erased. He told me he wanted me to have them back, not because he expected me to wear them again, but because he believed they represented a moment that had revealed the best part of who I was. I traced the edge of the boot with my thumb. The leather felt firmer than I remembered, as if strengthened by the journey it had taken. So had I. For a long time, I sat quietly on that bench, holding the boots in my lap, letting memory drift through me like the winter wind. I remembered the numbness in my toes that night. I remembered the emptiness of being left behind. But I also remembered the moment I acted without thinking, offering warmth to a stranger, because something deep inside me knew it mattered. I had not known then that this small act would become a hinge in my life. I had not known that kindness could lead me back to myself. After a while, I stood. My boots rested lightly in my hands as I stepped forward. The snow crunched under my feet with a softness that felt almost ceremonial. I found a small patch of untouched white beside the bench and placed the boots gently onto the snow. They sank slightly, leaving a faint imprint, like a signature of the person I had once been. I stepped back, looking at them, letting the past sit before me without guilt or longing. It was a farewell to the woman who had endured quietly for too long, to the fears that had kept me small. In the winters I survived without realizing I deserved more than survival. As I stood there, the quiet of the park wrapped around me like a blessing. I closed my eyes and inhaled the cold air deeply, feeling it cleanse me in a way warmth never could. When I opened my eyes again, the boots looked peaceful, almost as if they belonged to the snow. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out June's letter. I had read it many times by then, each reading carving its truth deeper into my heart. I whispered a soft thank you to the woman whose pain had mirrored mine and whose courage had illuminated a path I had never known existed. Then I did something I had not expected to do. I spoke aloud, letting my voice float into the open air. I asked a question that had lived quietly in my chest, waiting for the right moment. I asked it not only for myself, but for anyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten. I asked for those who had lost themselves in the service of others. I asked for the silent hearts who needed a place to exhale. If you have ever been forgotten or made to believe that your worth belonged to someone else, how did you stand up again? The question lingered in the cold morning air, carried by the soft wind that brushed across my face. It was an invitation, not a plea. A door left open for anyone who needed to walk through it. I turned back toward the bench, letting my hand trail along its frozen surface. The memory of that night no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a beginning, a necessary unraveling that had cleared the way for the life I was now stepping into. I took one last look at the boots resting in the snow, then I whispered the words that had been forming inside me since the moment I first felt the cold push against my feet that Christmas Eve. The words that finally made sense. That winter was too cold for me to stay still, but it was just cold enough to wake me. With that, I walked away, leaving the boots where they belonged. In the past, gently marked by the snow, a quiet monument to the woman I used to be and the woman I had finally become.